Alright guys, so in tonight's lesson we're gonna introduce chapter 4, section 1, States' Rights and Slavery. Alright, just a little recap. In class today we talked about the reform movements that stemmed from the Second Great Awakening, or all of those very energetic preachings, right, that we talked about. We have the temperance movement that involved alcohol. Remember, women in the church pressed for this the most. We have the women's rights movement, and suffrage was eventually their main concern. Remember, suffrage is the right to vote, that deals with the right to vote. And then lastly, we have the abolition movement, or the abolishment of slavery. That's what it dealt with slavery. And this was encouraged by educated middle-class Northerners. And remember, Southerners were strongly against it because they had that plantation system that relied on slavery. All right, where are we going? We're headed towards the Civil War. That's what we're getting towards right now. That's what we're going to talk about in Chapter 4. So the Civil War. So just keep that in mind. That's where we're going. Alright, the first issue we need to look at in this chapter is going to be the issue of states' rights. Remember, there's a great debate surrounding the role of the federal government at this time. While some favored a strong one, that should say one, not on, some favored a strong central government to unify the nation and provide economic support to citizens as well as infrastructure. That's what some people wanted. And remember, it could be a federal government, national government, or central. Federal, national, central. Remember, those three words can be used interchangeably. But again, some people favored that strong government in order to unify the nation, provide economic support to citizens, and provide infrastructure, or the a means of moving about, right? Infrastructure today are things like roads and interstate systems. Meanwhile, Southerners strongly opposed a strong federal government. Remember, this kind of goes back to that anti-federalist, federalist view. Southerners were very much against a strong national government. Instead, they advocated for states' rights. Or they suggested that any powers that weren't stated in the Constitution in black and white or spelled out explicitly should be reserved only for the states, right? So if it does not literally say it in the Constitution, the South believed that the federal government should not do it, and it should be dealt with on a case-by-case basis by the states. In 1832, we see the South Carolina nullification crisis emerge over these states' rights issues. At the time, South Carolina began protesting these high tariffs on British goods. Particularly passionate about this issue was Senator John C. Calhoun. He was a big champion of states' rights, or he was a big advocate. He promoted that and asserted that any state could refuse to enforce a law it saw unconstitutional, right? So he said that the state can refuse what the national government is saying if they think it's unconstitutional. And in 1832, South Carolina threatened to invoke that right to refuse to enforce a law and secede if the offensive tariffs were not replaced, right? So essentially, South Carolina said, if you do not get rid of these tariffs, we are going to secede from the Union. Or in other words, we are going to leave the Union. We're going to become our own country or our own confederation. President Jackson at the time was furious and threatened to send in federal troops to deal with this issue in South Carolina. However, Henry Clay to the rescue again. Remember Henry Clay and his American system from the last chapter. He proposed a compromise that both sides would eventually accept, and therefore ended the South Carolina nullification crisis. However, the issue of states' rights lingered until the Civil War. So we're going to see that linger for another 20 years or so. Alright, brief recap. So remember the Missouri Compromise that we talked about in the last chapter of 1820? It said that any state above the 3630, the green line in that picture right here, this little line right here, would be a free state. Anything above it would be a free state. Any new state that formed below that line was to be admitted as a slave state. And remember, Missouri was going to be a slave state if Maine was a free state. Additionally, we also looked at the Compromise of 1850. Remember, we dealt with the gold rush of California and the 49ers. The Compromise of 1850 said that California was to be admitted as a free state, as well as all Western territories, right? So not only just California, but any Western territory should be free. However, Utah and Mexico area or territories could decide via popular sovereignty. And remember, popular sovereignty is the will of the people. So it says if the people want to be free, then they'll be free. But if they don't, they'll be a slave state. And lastly, attached to that Compromise of 1850 was the Fugitive Slave Law. And that said that if a runaway slave escapes to the north, then those northerners that catch them should not give them shelter, but instead should return them to their owners in the south. But remember, many northerners refused to enforce it. They did not like this concept at all. They did not agree with it. Remember that compromise, or the Fugitive Slave Law, came with that Compromise of 1850. Alright, so now we're going to backtrack a little in terms of the issue of slavery. So just keep in mind, we've already talked about the Missouri Compromise of 1820 and the Compromise of 1850 a little, but now we're going to backtrack to 1846 and the Wilmot Proviso. So the war with Mexico was going on at that time, and that reignited that slavery debate. And in the summer of 1846, a Pennsylvania congressman named David Wilmot suggested this Wilmot Proviso. Remember, before the Compromise of 1850. Proviso, guys, just means condition. And he proposed banning slavery from any land purchased from Mexico. People in the North liked that, of course, because they were anti-slavery. They were for abolition, so pro-abolition. But remember, contested in the South, guys. They depended on that slavery in their plantation systems. Ultimately, this proviso was voted down. That's why we didn't talk about it so much in the last chapter. But it reopened the debate about slavery. That's the big thing, is that this issue just continued throughout these years. And again, this was before the Compromise of 1850, numerical order or chronological order, 1846, and then the Compromise of 1850. All right, so the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. So this is now after that Compromise of 1850 that said California was a free state and all the Western territories, and then popular sovereignty in Utah and Mexico with the Fugitive Slave Law, where you have to return captured slaves. All right, so back to this again. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. This allowed previously free and unorganized territories of Kansas and Nebraska to choose whether or not to permit slavery. Now, all of a sudden, they have this choice. Essentially, guys, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 repealed the Missouri Compromise of 1820 and reignited this whole slavery issue again. Essentially, at this time, Kansas became known as Bleeding Kansas because the people that lived and resided within Kansas became so divided. You had those people that were for slavery and those people that were against it, and they were just butting heads the entire time. Additionally, guys, fun fact, if you supported Kansas being free during this time, then you were nicknamed a Jayhawk, and that's where the Kansas Jayhawks mascot comes from. That's what it's rooted in. So it's rooted in this Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. And lastly, we're going to talk about Charles Sumner. So Sumner was a senator from Massachusetts who strongly opposed slavery, and he denounced this act and anyone who supported it in a 2-day speech to Congress, right? So he's this congressman from Massachusetts, and he pretty well got up in front of all the senators from all the other states and said, I don't like slavery, and anyone who does is wrong for that, right? But essentially a lot longer in a 2-day speech. However, of course, South Carolina, being from the South in that plantation system and being pro-slavery, our representative, Preston Brooks, he was very insulted by the speech. And he approached Sumner on the floor a couple of days later after his speech was done, and he actually beat Sumner with a cane, almost killing him, literally. So this is a very it's made light of now, but it was definitely an example of how slavery had become such a hot topic at the time, and inflamed passions were really starting to cause a lot of drama and tension between everyone at this time. So again, Charles Sumner, senator from Massachusetts, got beat on the floor of the Senate by South Carolina's Preston Brooks because he was insulted by that speech about slavery. Alright guys, that's all that I need you to do tonight or listen to tonight. So just make sure that you write your comment or your question about it, and have a good evening.